Hi, folks. Welcome to today's episode of ResourceWorks in webinar form. This is a thing we haven't done on a regular basis since the pandemic, but certainly hope this will be not the last one we do for a while. I'm joining you from our podcast studio, Power Struggle, which is hosted by Stuart Muir, our CEO. And my name is Margareta Dogal. I'm the Managing Director of the ResourceWorks Society. And today I'm really pleased to welcome Jerome Gesaroli to our studio for this special conversation. We're going to be talking about Beyond Borders, the Global Emissions Challenge, a 5-part series that Jerome has penned for us, available in full on the ResourceWorks website. Certainly hope those that haven't already checked it out, certainly take advantage of it, available on our site. And before we get going into the presentation, I just wanted to acknowledge our gratitude to be gathered here on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. ResourceWorks is committed to working closely with Indigenous communities towards reconciliation of all forms, including economic reconciliation. As we get into the conversation, certainly encourage you to start thinking of questions, and in fact, posing them. You can throw them right into the question and answer box here on Zoom. I'll give you some periodic reminders so you have a chance to give us a little debrief and things you're hearing, comments you have, and places you'd like the conversation to go. But without further ado, I'm going to pass it to Jerome for a little introduction, and then we'll get into the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Margareta. First of all, I'd like to thank ResourceWorks for hosting this webinar, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to listen in today. What I'm going to be talking about is based on the articles I wrote where we look at the complex challenges of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and look at why our national strategies are falling short of meeting the climate goals, because this seems to be a fairly consistent fact in many countries. Now, you look at this title, even this first overhead here that I have, the Global Emissions Challenge, and you might look and say, oh, another report or a webinar on how the world must come together as one and have its kumbaya moment and solve the climate crisis. Well, that's not the case here. Okay, I'm looking at facts, data, and I'm looking at the real issues that we're facing in trying to reduce emissions. I'll also offer a pragmatic approach that Canada should seriously consider to reduce emissions going forward. That's more cost-effective than what we're currently doing. So, as you're aware, the COP29 climate conference has been ongoing, and the message overall isn't too optimistic. There have been some significant efforts to reduce emissions globally. Okay, I don't want to minimize that, but the UN's targets for 2030 will very likely not be met. Okay, so there are rising emissions globally despite our collective efforts. The UN targets call for a 45% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030 compared to 2010 levels, and net zero by 2050. But the forecast suggests globally will be 9% higher than in 2030 compared to 2010 levels. So we're not just missing the targets, we're going in the opposite direction. And if we look at Canada, unfortunately, we're also very likely to miss our 2030 climate targets by over 120 megatons. So where are we here? So we've got this domestic focus right now. That we're prioritizing internal emissions within our political boundaries. That's how the climate program's been set up internationally. Each country is responsible for managing their own emissions and trying to reduce their own emissions. So each country sets their own climate targets and they try to meet them. And all that is concerned about is whether emissions are reduced within the political boundaries. And this is where there's a disconnect between the fact that the global climate target and the emissions issue, the challenge is a global factor, but we're focusing domestically. And there's a disconnect there. And so we need to look at a way, how can we broaden our emissions? How can we broaden our emissions policies to go beyond our borders, to collaborate with other countries? And we'll find that it's actually a lot more cost effective to do that than solely concentrate on trying to reduce greenhouse gases domestically.
But would you mind giving a little bit of a recap on where Canada has gone with its climate targets?
Yeah. Well, what we're forecasting under our current policies, the way we're progressing right now, we're going to miss our 2030 targets. Okay, and it's not because of it's not because of lack of funds or lack of policies. We spent a lot of money since, I think, 2015 to 2021. I think we spent over $115 billion, the federal government alone, in the different climate initiatives. And that's a conservative figure because it doesn't include what the federal government is spending in the last year, and it doesn't include the provincial expenditures. So we need to look at, what can we do better? What are we doing wrong, or what aren't we doing that we can improve our current policies? Okay. This is the situation. Is that the rationale for working with other countries is very practical. Okay. The fact is that in the future, developing countries will be on the hook for reducing more emissions than developed countries. Okay, and unfortunately, they're the ones that can least afford it. Now, developing countries all over are trying to work their way out of poverty. Okay, they're trying to put into growth policies in place to raise living standards, and I don't think we can fault any government for trying to do that for their citizens. Now, but raising living standards means more economic growth, and more economic growth means more energy consumption. And here are some points that will make meeting the goals so difficult. There's about 3.7 billion people in developing countries, a little bit less than half the world's population. Okay, and their populations are growing faster than populations are in developing countries. Moreover, the economies in developing countries are growing at a faster rate than in developed countries. Okay, and we know that more growth equals more energy use. So if we put all these together, these factors together, if developing countries are to escape poverty, they must develop economically a lot, and that means using a lot more energy. Okay, and so this is where we're getting this disparity between the countries that are going to be forced to carry the burden, actually, of the majority of emissions in the future, versus these same countries being least able to afford it. And you might say it's not right, and I agree, it's not fair, I agree, but it's the fact, it's the numbers. Now, here's an interesting graph. This just shows it so clearly. Okay, this shows the relationship between how much energy is used per person and income levels. And we see just a very high correlation between the two variables. Okay, the fact is that no country has ever become prosperous without using lots of energy. Okay, and this causes a real challenge in trying to lower emissions. So if we take the argument I made just a few minutes ago and add the developing countries rely heavily on coal-based power, which they do, and coal-based power, was a major GHG contributor, the problem becomes even more acute. This graph here basically quantifies the kind of the discussion that I've brought forward, the argument I made in the last few minutes here. Okay, so it shows the OECD countries, so that's mostly developed nations. It shows their growth in energy consumption increasing over time, but at a really relatively low rate. Okay, that's because their populations are really not growing, and the economies are mature and they don't grow at rapid rates. And we already are using quite a bit of energy. But look at the non-OECD. So these are primarily developing nations. Look at the rate and growth of energy consumption between 2020 and 2050. Okay, so then if we have any chance of meeting international climate goals, developing countries are going to have to meet a dual challenge. And this dual challenge is they're going to have to replace their current energy system that relies heavily on coal with renewable sources, and they're going to have to grow out their energy infrastructure using zero emission sources. We have here the projections for Canada going forward, and we say they're declining, but we're missing our targets significantly at 2030. You see, we're supposed to be between 40 and 45% below 2005 levels, and we're going to miss that substantially. Then we focus on the fact that is domestic only, our emissions, and we need to look broader. We need to look at international cooperation, because that's where a lot of the emissions are going to be occurring. And I outlined why we've got this problem with the difficulty in meeting emission challenge, because of the fact that there are so many people that are in developing countries, and they work their way out of poverty by growing economically. But we see in the following graph here that economic growth is highly correlated to increased energy usage. Okay, so Canada actually uses more energy per capita than the United States. So we're at the far right top part of this graph, but there's so many countries with large populations that are much further down. Look at India and many other countries that are further down in this graph. So if they're going to escape poverty, they're going to move up this graph, and that means using a lot more energy. And so we need to find a way of dealing with those emissions based on those new energy requirements. Okay, and this is what we get to when we're trying to forecast what the developing nations, the growth in emissions out to 2050 compared to the OECD countries, or primarily developed nations. Okay, look at the much fast growth rate in energy consumption.
And that's bridging the gap between developing and developed nations.
Yeah, that's right. So we can ask, so what's this, this reliance on coal? Very often we read, and the experts say, well, we have to move away from coal. It's much too dirty. It's a major contributor to carbon emissions. And, and they leave it at that. It's like with a wave of the hand, we need to make it go away. But the solution sounds simple, but it's actually doing it is anything but simple. And there's some very good reasons why coal is widely used in developing countries. First of all, it's cost effective and it's reliable. It's a constant source of energy. And it also provides energy security for countries that have coal deposits. They don't have to worry about international markets and fluctuating prices on importing other sources or fuel sources. And it can be scaled up as their economies grow using their existing infrastructure, which they fully understand and fully know how to use and work with. Okay, so some very good reasons why it's used extensively in developing countries. Now, let's take Southeast Asia, for example. Coal plants on average are just 11 years old. Now, they normally have an operating life of between 30 and 40 years. So, in other words, most coal plants are quite new. And if they try to shut these plants down before the end of their useful lives, it's extremely expensive. Okay, they have to take hundreds of billions of dollars in write-offs. And quite frankly, the companies wouldn't be able to do that without going broke. And if they tried to pass those costs on to recover those costs to their customers, it would lead to hugely expensive energy costs, which wouldn't be feasible either for these countries. And so governments would somehow have to come in and subsidize this massive effort. So, these are what we're actually faced with in reality. Some other practical considerations. The cost of capital in developing countries is 2 to 3 times higher than it is in developed countries. So in other words, you need a much higher rate of return before one's willing to invest in infrastructure in developing countries. So that's going to make it more challenging for private sector companies to take a large role. I'm not saying they can't take a role. I'm just saying it makes it more challenging. Another challenge for private sector investment is the foreign exchange risk. Okay, on not just the fluctuations, but repatriating profits and dealing with the local currencies. So I'm not saying, again, it can't be overcome, but it makes it more complicated. Now, in the COP29, you've been hearing some huge numbers being mentioned. Okay, 2, 3, we're talking the trillions, even the billions aren't enough. Now they're talking trillions. And the rough estimate is that about $2.6 trillion per year is going to be needed by developing countries if they're going to transition to a lower zero emission energy. Okay. Now, estimates suggest that they can finance about 60% of that amount, so 1.6 trillion themselves. So even if that's the case, that still leaves about $1 trillion per year that has to come from external sources, primarily developed countries, out to 2030. That's a lot of money. And how easy will it be for governments of more wealthy nations to convince their citizens that their voters to spend that much more on climate initiatives in other countries, especially when under the existing system we have, developed countries will get no credit for any emissions they do help to reduce outside their own borders. So there's no strong incentive for developed countries to invest significantly in reducing emissions and working with developing countries if they're not going to get any credit for that. Developed countries are already facing pushback domestically. We just look domestically here within Canada, but it's not just in Canada, it's all throughout Europe and the United States, etc. There's a lot of pushback on the money that's already being spent. So if there's no change in policy, then there's very, very high likelihood that we're not going to meet these global climate targets, okay? Now, there is one way that we can ameliorate the situation, improve the policy. There's this article that was originally developed and agreed upon in the Paris Agreement. And this article is Article 6, and it allows cooperative projects to be undertaken jointly by different countries. And it also allows the emissions that are reduced to get, each country can get credit for some of those emissions that reduced, and they can apply it towards meeting their own climate targets, their own national determined contributions. Okay, they're NDCs. So this is what we should be looking at very carefully going forward, very seriously, because this provides a significant incentive to have countries cooperate internationally on emission reduction projects outside of their domestic borders. Now, some people that are familiar with Article 6, they may criticize it. And some of the concerns are valid, others are not. So there's two categories, I think, of these criticisms. One is ideological. There's ideological criticism around using this Article 6 where developed and developing countries work together to reduce emissions, primarily in the developing countries. And it's based on the argument that developed countries are simply exploiting the less developed countries or taking advantage of them in some way. Okay. And so long as there's a few policy guardrails in place, which Article 6 seems to be doing, these concerns should have no real validity on stopping countries from using Article 6 projects. Now, another concern is that implementing the process to complete Article 6 projects is lengthy and complicated. Okay, that's somewhat of a valid concern. Part of using Article 6 effectively for Canada depends how fast we can learn all the and develop all the proper frameworks and rules and guidelines and processes that's needed so we can execute these projects efficiently. Okay. Now, countries such as Switzerland and Japan are significantly ahead of Canada. Canada's done very little in this area, and so we can learn from countries that are already further ahead with us. But there is a certain learning curve and putting processes together that are required. Hopefully, once we've learned that, then these projects can be implemented much more efficiently going forward. The reason why Article 6 and this cooperative policy is so important is that, one, it provides incentives for developed countries to work on reducing emissions internationally, because we can get credit for some of those emission reductions against our own domestic targets, but also it allows countries to use their comparative advantages. Now, comparative advantage is often used in the topics of trade. And that's the reason why trade is so powerful and why trade has exploded in value and in volume over the last 30, 40 years, because it allows a greater wealth to be created than if countries individually try to produce everything themselves. A comparative advantage then, in terms of climate policy and climate projects, would be, say, for developing countries, their comparative advantage would be in providing low-cost opportunities or lower-cost opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, there's many, many, many different projects internationally that haven't been undertaken yet for various reasons, that if they were, they would have a significant effect on lowering emissions, and they're not as expensive as if we solely invested in emission reduction projects domestically. Okay. Now, what's the comparative advantage for developed countries in terms of this cooperation? Well, developed countries bring advanced technologies, renewable technologies, engineering services, human capital, financing. We bring all those important factors to the table. Okay, so developed countries can participate in projects that reduce emissions at a lower cost than if they solely undertook these projects domestically. For developing countries, they can lower emissions they would otherwise not be able to do at all. Okay. Now, as I looked at this earlier, and a year or so ago, I did a study for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and I looked at undertaking methane reduction projects. Now, methane is a very GHG carbon intensive gas. And there's thousands of these methane reduction projects all over the world and many in Canada also. And I looked at if Canada just spent X amount of money and undertook methane reduction projects in Canada, and then I compared the result if they spent that same amount of money and undertook methane reduction projects, not just in Canada, but also internationally. And I found that for the same money, we would be able to double the emission reductions by widening our efforts to undertake them, not just in Canada, but internationally. So for the same money we spent, we could have double the results if we did international cooperation for methane reduction projects. Okay, another study done by University of Maryland suggests that overall, if countries in general take this approach of cooperating internationally, they could lower emission costs between $100 to $250 billion per year by 2030 by using cooperative frameworks like Article 6. So, so we're seeing here that this is something potentially that could have some serious benefits and make it much more cost effective to reach these climate goals that we should be taking a much more closer look at. So finally, just to kind of sum it up in a couple sentences, our current approach of focusing domestically on reducing emissions within our political boundaries is very expensive, and it's not leading to meeting our targets like we originally thought. Okay, we are finding that emissions are going to have to be reduced in a much more significant way in developing countries than developed countries, yet they don't have all the resources to do it themselves. So we need to look at policies that incentivize developed countries to work with developing countries. Now, this is not charity, this is not reparations or anything like that. This is simply a way for developed countries to get the maximum benefit of the money they spend, the dollars they spend to reduce emissions. And there has been some progress in COP29 for fine-tuning the Article 6 provisions, that's good. That's good, and that's something we need to hopefully carry on and work with in a more substantive way. That's basically what I wanted to review.
Yeah, it's a really good high-level overview, I think, of the work that you set out to do for us in that research series. So if anyone wants to dive into it a little bit deeper beyond this call, if it takes a little bit of time to think through some of these questions, certainly check out that series, get in touch with us. But we're here now, and we're going to have our audience Q&A. And I see there's already one question submitted, but I think to recap this a little bit, I'm going to pose one of my own, and then certainly encourage everyone to, share your comments and your thoughts. And just a heads up, I'll be sharing the name of the person asking.
Sure.
So feel free to throw in some more things if you want me to read something in terms of feedback or thoughts. But yeah, going to COP29. So Article 6 has been on the table for quite a while now. We've been talking about ways of implementing it and roadblocks on an international level for, I'm going to say, last 5-6 years at the very least.
Yes.
And, there's the domestic components. So I think your research does a really good job, Jerome, of outlining why, from a Canadian domestic policy perspective, we should be going for things that are highest value, highest impact. But of course, there's still tons of work left to negotiate it and get to full implementation globally. How do you characterize those challenges? Like, what are the things that just need to happen overall? What are things that Canada can specifically push so that we can actually get to biggest bang for buck emissions reduction through these mechanisms?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair question. It's an important question too with this Article 6. The concept is quite straightforward. Implementing it to ensure that we accomplish the goals we actually are truly trying to accomplish here on reducing emissions is non-trivial. Okay, so we need to develop, there has to be a lot of methodologies developed and processes that how countries and companies work together, okay, and how they're going to share information and how this information is going to be transparent and open to scrutiny to make sure that it's accurate. How emissions, each country has to come to agreement how we're going to measure emission reductions. And there's to be negotiations on how we're going to share those emission reductions. And we have to be very careful on the accounting that each country applies when they're applying these emission reductions against their NDCs, so that there's not this double counting. So the one unit of emission credit isn't claimed by both countries, by both parties. We don't want that. Okay, so we need some robust methodologies and processes to be developed so that we, truly, Article 6 accomplishes what it's trying to do, is to foster international cooperation and to have a net significant reduction in emissions.
Yeah, working out those accounting things.
Yeah, and progress has been made. It's not going slow, but it is being made. And as I said, there are some countries that are already kind of going ahead in this, going ahead with these Article 6 compatible projects, and we can take a look. We can take a look to see what they're doing, and we can leverage off them to a significant degree. But this is where, so far to date, I'm not aware of a whole lot that the federal government in Canada has been doing. There may be some things, but it's not public in a big way. And this is, I really strongly would recommend that the federal government look at this seriously, how we can implement, utilize this Article 6 to improve our own climate performance.
Yeah, and you sort of alluded to it. I see a question from the audience here about successful examples. Of course, there's still a lot of work to do to refine the methodology, make sure that it's actually fit for purpose. Lots of bilateral and multilateral negotiation needs to take place. But are there early examples? John Turner's asking, successful ones where it's already been used to reduce emissions.
Yeah. Well, I know that there's a project underway in Uzbekistan where there have agreements with a US-based company and a Korean-based company, and they each provide certain type of resources, and they're looking at reducing methane leakage in the energy sector in Uzbekistan. And now this is actually a very interesting project, because the Uzbekistan energy company that has the infrastructure that they're trying to make repairs and fix these leakages, they will save on energy and natural gas if it's not leaked. So these repairs will help them save energy, and they can resell that and actually make money from that process. And from the perspective of the external parties, so the US party and the Korean company, they provide some of the technical expertise, and they provide some of the initial financing to do the work. And they're going to be able to share in the emission reductions. And these emission reductions, these emission credits, we call them International Transferable Mitigation Outcomes, ITMOs, they'll be able to take some of them. They've been negotiated. They're allowed some of them, and they have value, and they can be resold to countries or to other companies that need them. So that's one good example. But Switzerland has a number of projects with Ghana, and they're very much more simple ones in terms of changing how they use their cooktop stoves and things like that, going away from wood or coal and using more climate efficient methods. So there are different opportunities. There's also one. Japan, I believe, is using, with Japanese company, with a company in Thailand, where they use coal right now to generate power, and they're converting that plant to use natural gas. And as a result, they're going to reduce emissions about 40, 50+% from that switch from coal to natural gas. And there'll be an emission savings that way that both parties will be able to share in.
That's really positive progress, actually. And I recall just a couple of years ago, I was in the UK doing a master's in climate policy at UCL in 2018. And, speaking of some of the challenges in building that accounting methodology, avoiding double counting, my small class was given a fun assignment by our professor who travels to a lot of climate conferences. I want you to go through and figure out how I can mitigate all of my emissions. And we had to look at all the commercially available tools, and it wasn't a perfect exercise. Obviously, agreements between countries, markets, solutions for trading credits. Of course, that's a little bit different, but certainly made clear just how much uncertainty there still is.
Yeah.
And it's great to see that actually being resolved. Because if we
Yeah.
want to see not only countries pursue domestic decarbonization, succeed at that, but also then get to the last mile and further reduce emissions globally for this issue, we're going to have to see those mechanisms get fully worked out.
Yeah, the last mile is usually the most expensive. So if we're nowhere near the last mile, and if we find it so expensive right now, then there's something that we need to refocus on. To make things more cost effective in reducing these emissions, and this is one area we can look towards.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned a little bit about fuel switching, and your presentation spoke a little bit about coal. I see there's some interest in the audience from David Steves about fusion energy. So just wanted to get a sense of maybe moving beyond the mechanisms, more to the technologies and that energy mix. What are you seeing and hearing? What are you hoping to see so that we can get to full technological deployment of viable, suitable, affordable technologies to reduce emissions on the generation, transmission, use side, but then also get into the credits, trading, and full implementation of Article 6 on the other side of it.
Yeah, I just from what I read and what the restrictions are and what's needed to operate a modern growing economy, and especially in the developing countries, it will be a mixture of technologies. Okay, so they will be able to utilize renewables, solar and wind. Hydro it's much more limited by geography and geology. Okay, but there still will be coal. There still will be coal, and for two reasons. One, because the coal infrastructure and the plants are so new that it makes them almost prohibitively expensive to shut them down at this stage, and there that could present an opportunity to look at some fuel switching from coal to natural gas. Now, it's an imperfect solution in that natural gas still releases greenhouse gases, but if we can reduce, say, 40, 50, even 60%, that's what the studies are suggesting by this fuel switching, we can still make meaningful progress in the interim until these technologies, the renewables, and the infrastructure allows for countries to wean themselves off coal. Okay, so in that way, natural gas has been talked about a transition fuel, and I truly believe that it could be a transition fuel, and obviously that would be in Canada's interest to look at, where there's some very, very large potential emission reductions in switching from coal to natural gas, internationally. And this is where, the United States has made big progress in reducing their emissions over the last number of years. And a large part of those emission reductions were by switching over from coal to natural gas in power generation in the United States. So the US has taken that approach.
So in some ways, let me know if this characterization makes sense. A lot of the conversation we have here in Canada about ways that we can reduce our emissions, I feel like they're failing to see the global picture, and I'm curious if you would agree. We're talking a lot about decarbonization in terms of, not only domestic in Canada, but household domestic emissions in that sense. We're talking about decarbonization of industry, particularly those that are really emissions intensive. Challenge being that many of them are trade exposed, so you end up reducing competitiveness when you would use those things. Not enough focus has been put on not only the things we can do for negotiating with other countries, working to get to that full deployment of Article 6, even if it's not completely ready for prime time globally, just seeing what Canada can accomplish. And then also I wonder if putting more of an emphasis on the production of fuels like natural gas, which can enable that fuel switching, is another viable way to look at Canada's valuable contribution to climate change mitigation on a global scale.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one way. The other way is the technology that Canada has in its energy sector. We've already made significant strides in reducing the emissions that we emit on the energy we produce, and we can why not utilize that technology and get involved in projects outside of Canada where this technology can be used to also have foreign countries reduce the emissions that are produced in their own energy sector. That could be another thing worth looking at. This has to be, in terms of the Article 6 initiatives, it has to be initiated by the federal government at first, okay? They need to take the lead on that. And then once the framework is set up with another country, then it is easier for commercial enterprises to get involved and to look at specific projects. But it will have to come initially from the federal government here.
Makes a lot of sense. And we have a great comment from Rita Conte here in the chat, touching on a lot of different points. So I'll just kind of skim through it here. And I'd like to get your take, Jerome, on a specific point. And after that, we will get back to technologies a little bit. So get ready for that. But to Rita's comment here, a key point to make with Article 6 is it doesn't recognize that resource-dependent producing countries, such as the US and Canada, compared to those like Japan, Switzerland, Sweden, they're non-energy producing nations. So a lot of what you were just describing and we were chatting about. And she comments that the emissions drive for reductions is not aligned with the growth of GDP. And there's another piece where she touches on transparency. So countries like Pakistan, India, Brazil, and Africa not necessarily having that effective, open, transparent way of accounting for their emissions. Inaccuracies, fraud, lots of challenges that come up in that. So trying to get a sense from you, how much reliability do you think we can expect from our partners who potentially would be working with to get some of those hardest to reach but most impactful emissions? Yeah,
the viewer actually raises some really good points and important points. And that's one of the reasons why it's taken as long as it has to kind of draft the details of Article 6 way back in 2015, so almost 10 years. And they're still working on them because we have to make sure that if we're going to go this approach, that there is that transparency and that it's open to scrutiny, that emission reductions actually are occurring and to the level that is stated, and that they're not being double counted, etc. And and that's the reason why it's taking so long. But there is progress being made. Also, I'm not too concerned about the Canadian companies' projects that might get involved in Article 6 type initiatives. I'm more concerned about, as you said, some of the countries that are more open to corruption and less ethical practices, on them trying to exploit any weaknesses in Article 6. And that's where I mentioned about some policy guardrails put in place with with regard to Article 6 projects, that it is important. It is important. And yeah, I don't want to underestimate that. But just because there are potential issues, it doesn't mean that it should be abandoned, that it's not generally a good idea, because we'd be kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak.
Absolutely. Well, we have time for at least I think 2 more questions.
Okay.
So if anyone is still hoping to ask something, maybe specifically on Article 6 implementation, maybe a little bit more broadly, feel free to do that in the chat. I'm going to ask you something a little bit more philosophical. Well, maybe I'll start with a question from Cameron Mill, and I'll put a little point on it. So Cameron asks, just confirming that your premise is that investments in GHG reduction initiatives of developing countries can result in greater GHG. Sorry, and maybe I'm misreading. There's a lot of oh, there we go. So talking about incentives for investing countries, if they're able to record credits towards their domestic reduction targets. There's, of course, the possibility of economic returns as well with that. So just trying to get a sense in terms of like long-term sustainability. We see this as a viable and necessary next step where we currently are with the fight against climate change on a global scale. But what comes after that? How do you ensure that this supports the type of energy poverty eradication, economic development, and long-term outcomes that allow for us to reach multiple goals concurrently?
Okay, I'll answer that based on kind of my interpretation of the question there, Cameron. First of all, I think that there's actually a real win-win with doing this cooperative approach, because if we bring technology to the table and expertise to the table for these developing countries, not only is there a net reduction in emissions, but very often there's a technology transfer that takes place, or they have some new infrastructure that's developed that's much more modern and up to date, and that actually are kind of positive externalities. They're benefits that accrue to the developing countries, that makes these things sustainable over the longer term. The other thing, from the developed countries' perspective, even though we would be focusing more of our efforts internationally than just solely domestically. We don't abandon, obviously, reducing emissions domestically, but we do. By going this approach, we can achieve emission reductions in the shorter term, and we can let the technology mature and catch up so that we can commercially and effectively use it domestically. So I'm just thinking of the electric vehicle sector. We're trying so fast to move to electric vehicles, but there's so many issues. The technology is good, but it's kind of not quite there in a number of different ways. We don't have the infrastructure in place, the raw materials to supply all the for battery productions. It's not. We have to wait. It just takes time to develop that. But in the meantime, if we can score some wins with cooperative projects, Article 6 type projects, then that allows us to reduce emissions in the interim, and then we carry on and we'll be able to further reduce our emissions as we allow these other technologies to mature and become more commercially, economically viable domestically.
So essentially, you're saying that Article 6 implementation it's an interim measure. It's a way that we can get to the technological deployment and readiness to fully decarbonize. But that's going to take a lot of years.
That's right. That's right. It is best used as in the interim, in the short to medium term.
Right. And just to put that into context a little bit, where do you see our technological pathway right now? Like you were sharing a graph a little bit earlier, a chart that was showing, this really, really strong association we see between energy consumption and quality of life. That's certainly borne out in the experience of a lot of developing countries who are actively trying to increase their quality of life. Requires a lot of energy to get there. We are slowly seeing that decoupling of economic growth from emissions growth in places like British Columbia and Canada, but that's happening very slowly, not at the point where we're necessarily meeting very ambitious climate targets. So just trying to get a sense of, what do you see as a trajectory for our ability to get to that technology readiness? We have Article 6 in the interim. There's lots of work being done on efficiency and just ways of, in some cases, really minutely, in other cases, really massively reducing emissions on every level.
So
how what's your forecast basically?
So in terms of, just so I understand your question, so in terms of how quickly or what it'll take for Canada or BC to
globally
to achieve these extremely low emissions overall, is that
Are you an energy transition doomer, or are you an energy transition? Would the right term be boomer? Are you excited that there's a possibility to pick up pace really quickly? Or
I'll tell you what I am. I believe in technological progress. I believe that with incentives in place, we can achieve great things. Technology can have major impact, and we've seen it throughout history. There's always been doomsayers on when we're not going to have enough food to feed the population, we're going to run out of resources, etc. And we are always innovative enough and develop the different efficiencies and technologies that allow us to continue to prosper and grow. And I don't see why that's any different with regard to reducing emissions. But it can't happen overnight. It just takes time, and we have to realize that. But that doesn't say that we shouldn't try to do anything to reduce emissions in the interim. Obviously, we need to do that, but we just can't push things faster than they can develop. So we have to look at other policies in the interim that will help us lead to our goals.
Yeah, otherwise you might end up with unintended consequences that's
For sure.
that impact your ability to deal with climate change when it hits.
For sure. Yeah.
So I think I'll wrap us up with one final question, something a little bit newsier over the last couple of years. We've been talking a lot about energy demand for a new industry that's popped up, artificial intelligence. Data centers need a lot. There's lots of debate happening in the US on how they're going to meet that, where there's a lot of that production happening. Canada's also rapidly growing, and our industry is investing in building those data centers, which use a lot of energy. It could be that, it could be another demand. It could just be the drive to electrification for industries that previously didn't need electricity. How are we going to meet that? How do we scale quickly enough?
Well, I mean, that's a challenge. That's a challenge. And these data centers, I mean, some of the numbers they're putting out for energy requirements is truly massive. Amazon and Microsoft, I mean, they're literally signing agreements with nuclear power operators to reactivate one of the reactors on 3 Mile Island and things like that. Elon Musk, one of his companies, Grok, that does the AI. I think he's setting up a big facility right beside a natural gas plant to supply power. So they're massive power sources. I think if I'll give some time, and we're going to see that these AI type data centers are probably going to become a lot more efficient on how we're doing AI in general, and also how much energy is going to be required for these data centers. So I suspect that going forward, these huge numbers that are being forecast may be maybe a little bit off base in that they're too high, but nevertheless, it's going to be a big source of energy required. Renewables. Their intermittency, you can't have that with a data center. They have to be 99.9999 of the 5 nines, a reliable energy source. So a lot of players are looking at nuclear energy, whether it's small modular reactors or repurposing existing reactors to provide that energy.
Yeah, No surprise. Well, I guess we'll see if it comes out in the wash, due to those efficiency improvements and, how we get maximum compute
Yeah.
translate to that rapid growth energy demand slowing down a little bit, or, maybe it's just the widespread deployment of these technologies that'll drive that growth, even if they're more efficient. But lots of things to watch and track, including things coming out of COP29. Thank you so much, Jerome, for joining us. This is a great conversation, and we're also really thankful to you, our audience, for joining us. Thank you for your patience bearing with us as we had a couple of technical difficulties here at the start. And if you have any questions, you want to pick our brains a little bit more, feel free to always reach out at info@resourceworks.com. Happy to pass along questions to Jerome. And yeah, really looking forward to seeing you guys in the next one.
Great. Thank you, Margaretta. Yeah.
All the best, folks. Thank you.